It's not good to have money in Luke's gospel. There are a ton of parables in Luke's gospel where the basic message is these rich folk are terrible jerk faces. I mean, sure, Luke opens up with a couple of songs by Zechariah, John the Baptist's father, and Mary, Jesus' mother, that are really good news for poor people and really bad news for rich people, but Luke can't only be about good news for poor people and bad news for rich people, right? Right? Guys? I mean, Luke is very obvious. You've got Jesus talking about old and new wineskins, blessings to those who are oppressed and woes to those who are not. You've got the tax collectors and the sinners welcoming Jesus and the religious elites rejecting Jesus. Then you've got the parable of the sower, which is all about some folk whose hearts are hardened to the good news and other folks who receive it warmly. You've got the parable of the Good Samaritan that flies right in the face of people's expectations of who good people are and are not. You've got the parable of the lost things, in which you've got Jesus telling the religious elite, hey, you guys aren't listening, so maybe they will, and they do. Today, we have the parable of the rich man and the beggar, which is, well, I'm sure you can guess. There's an unnamed rich man and a beggar named Lazarus, and the two couldn't be more different. When they die, one goes to Hades and the other one goes to Abraham's bosom, which is actually incredibly problematic for a Christian worldview of the afterlife because Jesus is speaking to people in a way that they will understand, which is, let's take a little bit of Hebrew, let's take a little bit of Greek, let's smash them together so that everyone is equally confused by this. I actually remember someone, when I was in confirmation class, trying to base a lesson on this, a lesson about like how heaven and hell work based on this passage. And then when I got to seminary and found out that that really isn't a good way to do that, I was like, oh, well, that kind of changes a lot, doesn't it? So anywho, in the afterlife, the rich man calls out across the great chasm between Hades and Abraham's bosom, and he cries out, Abraham, Abraham, send Lazarus to dip his tip of his finger in some water so that a drop of it might fall on my tongue. Abraham just says, well, you received good things in your life, and Lazarus received bad things in his life, so now you're getting bad things now, and he's getting good things now. I told you it's really not good for people with money in Luke's gospel. Then the rich man says, oh, then Abraham, send Lazarus to talk to my 5 brothers so that they might avoid the fate that I have. And Abraham just says, well, they've read the Bible, right? They know what's in there. That's enough. And then the rich man says, oh, no, Abraham, if someone comes back from the dead, they'll listen. And Abraham says, if they don't listen to Moses and the prophets, then they won't even be convinced if someone rises from the dead. There's a lot going on in this parable. I mean, you've got 2 people, one of high station, one of lowly station. One man lived in luxury every day. The other man basically yearned for something of the other man's luxury, but never actually got it. The rich man had every opportunity to help Lazarus out, but never did. I mean, imagine seeing the same beggar so much that you actually learn their name and still ignoring them completely. They both die, then the rich man is the one that needs a little bit of help, and even in torment, if you notice, the rich man can't acknowledge Lazarus. He only talks to Abraham. He never once addresses Lazarus. But I think the most interesting part of the parable is that part. That even in death, the rich man can't acknowledge that Lazarus is a human being, and instead views him at best as a servant. See, usually this passage is preached about the bit at the end, where if you don't know Moses and the prophets, they're not going to believe if somebody even rises from the dead. And I've heard this passage preached usually something like, everything we need to know about Jesus is in the Bible already. The Old Testament prophesies about Jesus, and then you get to the New Testament, Jesus is there, and it's great news. That's how I usually hear this preached. But I don't think that's necessarily what Luke intends. Because I think what Luke is getting at, because of the context of everything else, he's focusing on these elites, the rich, the religious leaders, and how mad they are at Jesus for talking to the tax collectors and the sinners. Because the way they're seeing it, Jesus should be paying attention to them and ignoring the tax collectors and the sinners like they do. Because this message of Luke overwhelmingly is about power and oppression, and how those in power oppress those without power. And the main way that that happens is very simple. It's when you stop viewing people as people, which is exactly what the rich man is doing to Lazarus. As far as the rich man is concerned, Lazarus is just a nobody beggar who can be sent to do his errands for him. You can almost picture it when they're alive, right? Hey, Lazarus, I have a job for you. Help me move this couch and I'll get you some food. Hey, Lazarus, go and buy me some stuff from the market and you can keep a little bit for yourself, like an apple maybe, one whole apple. I don't think the rich man is a very generous man. I'm getting that impression. So even in the afterlife, he yells to Abraham, Abraham, send Lazarus to do this. Abraham, send Lazarus to do that. For the rich man, Lazarus isn't a person. He's a thing. I imagine we've all seen this or experienced this, especially if you've ever worked in a customer service job. Because if you've ever worked in a customer service job, you know that there are people out there who don't view people in customer service jobs as anything but a thing meant to serve them at that moment. You see it in restaurants, you see it in retail. The person doesn't matter. The job that they're doing is all that matters. It's amazing what you can see about people when you're in a restaurant. It's amazing. I think everyone should have to work customer service at some point in their life. And when we forget that people are people, we start to take advantage of them. We start to try to get things out of them. We treat them badly. We expect things from them that are unrealistic at best and terrible at worst. And it becomes oppression when it's given enough time and enough power in between. And these things that are oppression happen over and over. We've seen it in big ways. I bet we can all agree that the systematic enslavement of a people group based on the color of their skin is oppression. I think we can all agree with that. I think we can also all agree that the imprisonment of American citizens because they happened to be of Japanese descent was also oppression. I think that's safe to say. And it's easy to see oppression in the big ways. But what about the little ways? What about the little things that people hear and say that are just as oppressive? They're just smaller. Things like, you throw like a girl. Tell that to a female softball player, and I bet they will show you what a girl throws like. Man up. Actually, I saw a thing on the internet that I thought was great. Instead of saying man up, you should say fortify. Doesn't that sound good? Fortify. That's gay. Or one of the worst, and was really popular when I was a kid, that's retarded. You see where these might be a problem? Even things like, I got gypped. are oppressive. They seem innocent. The first two, though, they make women bad and men good. The next two imply that certain people are less than other people. And the last one is a racial stereotype. These small things add up and they become symptoms of a problem, and the problem is taking away another person's personhood. In this parable and in the entire Gospel of Luke, we see Jesus' opposition to taking away someone's personhood. Because Luke's Gospel is all about bringing freedom to those oppressed people. Be they poor, be they sick, be they disabled, or be they sinners. This is really good news if you're oppressed. It's really good news. But there's a problem, because we like to read ourselves into the places where the good news is. We see Jesus saying good news to the poor, and we say, oh, well, I feel pretty poor. We see Jesus saying good news to the sick, and we say, oh, I feel pretty sick. Unfortunately, too often we also are perpetuating these oppressive things in our daily life. Without realizing it, we sometimes perpetuate racism, sexism, classism, ageism, and so many other discriminatory practices. But if we allow the Holy Spirit to work in us and show us people as God sees them, as people whom He died for, it will change completely how we live in our lives. This, of course, flows right in from the parable of the Good Samaritan. Love God with your whole heart, mind, soul, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. And oh, by the way, who's your neighbor? Anyone who needs help. Anyone who needs help. The rich man, in ignoring the personhood of Lazarus, that was a symptom of his not following God. Jesus says in John's Gospel, how will people know if you are my disciples? If you love one another. Because it's when we start to see people as God sees them, we start to love them and we cherish their personhood. We look for ways that we can help out, for ways that we can be Christ to them. We stop categorizing God's people and instead view them as each one individually a child of God. Because all of God's children are the ones whom Jesus dies for. All of God's children are the ones whom Jesus rose again for. And this parable of the rich man and Lazarus, well, on the surface, it just seems about the good news of Jesus rising from the dead in the bit in Luke's Gospel. And how even if someone rises from the dead, some people just won't pay attention. What it's really about is making sure that we keep realizing that people are people. That we see them through God's eyes. And we can be Jesus to them when they need it. Whether they just need lunch, whether they need help moving a couch, or whether they just need someone to be there for them. We can be Jesus because He calls us to do what He did, to be a neighbor, to be loving, to love one another as He has loved us.